The first person to notice something strange wasn't a farmer. It was the county's honey supplier. As he drove past the Carter family farm one bright June morning, he slowed his truck almost to a stop. Thousands of bees floated over the fields like a living golden cloud. The sound was so loud it filled the air with a steady hum. He frowned. For years, hardly any bees had visited this part of the county. Most farms looked quiet and lifeless during flowering season. But one field was different. It shimmered with color. Purple, yellow, blue, red, and white wildflowers stretched along the edges of every crop, alive with bees, butterflies, and birds. The supplier smiled to himself. Whoever owns this farm knows exactly what they're doing. What he didn't know was that just 3 months earlier, everyone in town had been laughing at the person responsible. And that person was only 16 years old. Lily Carter had spent her entire life on the small family farm just outside Willow Creek, Iowa. The farm wasn't large. It had 25 acres of vegetables, pumpkins, squash, cucumbers, and a small sunflower field that her late father had planted every spring because he believed a farm should always have something beautiful growing. After he passed away 5 years earlier, Lily's mother, Sarah, worked from sunrise until long after dark, trying to keep the farm alive. Every year became a little harder. Fuel prices climbed. Seeds became more expensive. The weather grew less predictable. Some seasons brought too much rain. Others brought almost none. By the time Lily turned 16, the farm was surviving, but only just. Sarah often sat at the kitchen table late at night with a calculator, quietly adding and subtracting numbers that never seemed to work. Lily noticed everything. She noticed the unpaid bills tucked beneath recipe books. She noticed how her mother skipped buying new boots because the old ones could last one more season. She noticed the worried look on her face every time another field failed to produce what it once had. One evening, after another disappointing harvest, Sarah sighed as she looked over the accounts. "If next year isn't better," she whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know how much longer we can keep this place." Lily didn't answer. But those words stayed with her. A week later, while volunteering at the town library after school, Lily wandered into the agriculture section. An old book with a faded green cover caught her attention. Its title read, "Nature's Partners, Farming with Pollinators." Most of the pages were yellow with age. Inside were photographs of farms surrounded by strips of native wildflowers. The book explained how bees and other pollinators dramatically increased yields in many crops by carrying pollen from flower to flower. One sentence refused to leave Lily's mind. Sometimes the smallest workers create the biggest harvest. She borrowed the book. Then another. Then another. For the next month, she watched documentaries, read university articles online, and filled an old notebook with sketches. She wasn't dreaming. She was planning. Spring arrived earlier than expected. While neighboring farmers prepared every available inch of land for planting, Lily carried small paper bags filled with wildflower seeds. Her mother looked up from repairing an irrigation hose. "What are those for?" Lily smiled. "I want to plant flowers." Sarah blinked. "Flowers? Around the fields. We're trying to grow food, sweetheart." "I know. So why flowers?" Lily opened her notebook and pointed to drawings of bees visiting blossoms before moving into vegetable crops. "If we bring back more pollinators, they'll help the vegetables produce more." Sarah studied the pages. It sounded reasonable. But it also sounded risky. That means giving up part of our land. Only the edges. And what if it doesn't work? Lily hesitated. Then quietly answered, "What if it does?" Sarah looked across the tired fields. Every expert she'd listened to over the years had promised bigger harvests through expensive fertilizers, costly chemicals, or new machinery. None of them had solved their problems. Finally, she smiled. "You've never asked me for much." She handed Lily the seed bags. "Let's try it." The next morning, mother and daughter spent hours planting strips of colorful wildflowers along fences, irrigation channels, and the borders of every field. Passing drivers slowed down to stare. Some laughed openly, others shook their heads. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in Willow Creek had heard about the Carter farm. At Miller's feed store, the conversations became impossible to avoid. "Did you hear what Sarah's daughter is doing? Planting flowers instead of crops? Guess they've decided butterflies pay better than pumpkins." The room erupted in laughter. One farmer smirked. "Maybe she'll open a wedding garden." Another added, "Or a park." Even Sarah heard the jokes when she stopped by the hardware store. "They're beautiful," one man chuckled. "Shame beauty doesn't pay the bills." Sarah forced a smile. But inside, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Weeks passed. Nothing remarkable happened. The flowers were still tiny. The crops looked ordinary. The laughter continued. Even Lily began questioning herself. Then, one quiet morning, she stepped outside before sunrise and froze. The air was humming, not with machines, not with wind, with thousands of wings. Bees, more than she'd ever seen in her life. They drifted through the blooming wildflowers before spreading into the vegetable fields in every direction. Lily stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. She smiled, but she had no idea. The bees were only the beginning. The next few weeks transformed the Carter farm in ways no one could explain. Every morning before school, Lily walked the fields with her notebook in hand. The wildflower borders were alive with honeybees, bumblebees, butterflies, and even hummingbirds. What amazed her most wasn't how many insects she saw. It was where they went. They didn't stay in the flowers. After feeding for a few moments, they drifted into the pumpkin blossoms, cucumber vines, squash plants, and sunflower rows before returning to the colorful borders. It was exactly what the books had described. Nature was doing the work no machine ever could. One afternoon, Sarah paused while picking cucumbers. "Lily," she called. "Come here." Lily hurried over. Her mother held up 2 cucumber plants growing side by side. "This one usually gives us 4 or 5 cucumbers." She pointed to the second plant. "This one already has nearly double that." Lily smiled but said nothing. It was too early to celebrate. By mid-July, the changes were impossible to ignore. The Carter farm looked different. The pumpkin vines spread farther than usual. The squash plants were covered with blossoms. The cucumbers grew straighter and larger. Even the sunflowers stood taller than anyone remembered. Across the road, neighboring farmers began noticing. Tom Henderson leaned against his pickup truck one afternoon, staring across the fence. "Funny," he muttered. "They're using less fertilizer than we are." His brother shrugged. "Must have gotten lucky." Tom wasn't convinced. Luck didn't usually last that long. Then came the weather forecast no farmer wanted to hear. An unusually dry summer had settled over the county. The local meteorologist warned that rainfall would remain far below normal for several more weeks. Soon the soil hardened. Small cracks appeared across the fields. Leaves curled beneath the relentless afternoon sun. Farmers ran irrigation systems day and night, burning expensive fuel just to keep their crops alive. Even then, many plants began to fail. Sarah looked over their fields with quiet concern. "If this keeps up," she whispered, "everyone's going to lose something." Lily nodded. She couldn't stop the drought, but she noticed something unusual. The thick layer of flowers and native grasses surrounding their fields shaded the soil along the borders. Bees continued visiting from sunrise until evening, pollinating every blossom that survived the heat. Their crops weren't untouched by the drought. But they were holding on far better than anyone expected. One Saturday morning, Sarah loaded vegetables into the truck for the county farmers market. She stopped halfway. "Lily," the truck bed was already full. There were still baskets waiting beside the barn. "We've never harvested this much by this time of year." At the market, customers noticed immediately. The Carter vegetables looked fresh, colorful, and healthy, while many vendors apologized for smaller harvests. Within an hour, Sarah had sold almost everything. Returning home, she looked at Lily with tears in her eyes. "I haven't seen a market day like this since your dad was alive." Lily hugged her tightly. Neither of them noticed someone watching from across the parking lot. It was Tom Henderson. Harvest season finally arrived. Every farmer in Willow Creek gathered for the county yield report, an annual tradition where neighbors compared results before winter. One by one, disappointing numbers were announced. Corn yields were down. Vegetable harvests had fallen. Pumpkin production had dropped across most of the county. The room grew quieter after every report. Then the final farm was announced. The Carter family farm. The county official looked at the paperwork twice. Record pumpkin production. Record cucumber yield. The highest squash harvest in over 12 years. A murmur spread across the room. Heads turned toward Sarah. Someone whispered, "How?" Another farmer stood. "It doesn't make sense." Tom Henderson slowly raised his hand. "I think." Everyone looked at him. "I think it was the flowers." The room fell silent. Tom continued, "I laughed when they planted them." "So did I. But all summer long I watched bees covering their fields while ours stayed almost empty." Another farmer nodded. "I noticed that too." "So did I." Within moments, conversations filled the hall. Maybe the flowers weren't wasting land after all. Maybe they'd been adding something the rest of them had forgotten. Life. A few days later, trucks began stopping outside the Carter farm. Not to laugh, to learn. Farmers walked beside Lily as she explained which native flowers she had planted, why different species bloomed at different times of the season, and how the borders kept pollinators returning month after month. She showed them her notebook, now filled with observations instead of guesses. No expensive secrets, no miracle chemicals, just patience, research, and respect for nature. Tom smiled as he closed the notebook. "You know, I've been farming for 30 years. And today, a 16-year-old taught me something I've never understood." Lily laughed. "I just listened to the bees." The following spring, something beautiful happened. Driving into Willow Creek, visitors noticed ribbons of wildflowers surrounding farm after farm. Purple, gold, white, blue. Fields that had once looked plain now buzzed with life. Children stopped to watch butterflies. Beekeepers reported stronger colonies. Birdsong returned to places that had been quiet for years. The county agricultural office even featured the Carter farm in its annual newsletter as an example of practical conservation improving crop production. When a reporter asked Lily how it felt to change so many minds, she smiled toward the fields where thousands of bees drifted between flowers under the warm morning sun. "I didn't change anyone's mind," she said softly. "I just gave nature a chance to do what it has always known how to do." Sometimes the biggest harvest doesn't begin with bigger machines. It begins with one person willing to plant something everyone else believes is useless. And sometimes the smallest wings can carry the biggest miracles.